Hi, my name is Ryan, and I want to talk to you a little bit about single-handed Skagit casting. Why you do it, how to set it up. It's something that when I got into it, there were not a lot of resources, and I was just basically confused and had to figure it out for myself. You've probably seen people doing it on YouTube, on Instagram. The cool thing about using a Skagit head on a single-hand rod is, A, you've already got most of the equipment, and B, it lets you cast in places where you normally couldn't make a back cast. So the biggest problem for me was the setup. It's what I just could not figure out, or it didn't make sense to me, because there was no good explanation on the internet when I got into it. And if you come from a regular fly fishing background, you know backing on a reel. That's how you start, just like a normal fly line. So after you're backing, you need a running line. And there are lots and lots of options for running lines. Monofilament, and this is Strand Catfish Mono, the cheap stuff. Monofilament is a great running line because it shoots like crazy. And everyone wants to cast far and easily. So a smooth, easy shooting line makes a great running line. Rio sells a mono running line. OPST sells a really good mono running line. I'm cheap, so I like this. Usually want 25, 30 pounds. That's if you're fishing for little fish. Easier to grab. If you're fishing for big steelhead salmon, something like that, maybe you want something bigger. That's personal opinion there. So you need a running line. Mono is great. However, mono has memory. Mono coils, which makes it hard to manage line well. In the summer, in warmer water, if you're fishing for warm water species, or you're fishing for trout in warmer water, which maybe you shouldn't be, mono is pretty good. It slacks out pretty good. In the winter, it can get kind of messy. So there are other alternatives. You can go with a regular coated running line, just like your fly line. Like this is just a piece I had laying around that I cut off. And it's just like normal coated fly line. It floats, has just a tiny little bit of stretch. And that's great if you want to fish nymphs, because you can mend it. Mono, you can't really mend. Another good option is Airflow's Miracle Braid, and that is a braided running line. And that's great because it shoots like crazy. Can't mend it. And you also, sometimes you have issues in the winter because braid absorbs water and then it can freeze. But that's a whole nother story. But there are options. Most people start out with mono. I use mono on everything only because I like the way it shoots. And the nice thing about going with cheap mono like this is, if you make a mess and get 100 tangles and knots in it, you just cut it off and start over. It's not really a big deal. Once you put mono on the reel, here's a reel that's got mono on it. It's got backing and mono. You can't really see the backing. But this is a little 4-weight that I fish on an 8.5 foot 4-weight rod. So you got your mono, your running line, whatever you choose to use. You need a loop. Tie yourself a perfection loop, or whatever loop knot you prefer. And then we get to talk about heads. Now the head is the important part. That's what does all the work. On this, I fish a Rio Skagit Trout Max. These are short little heads. This is 175 grain, and it's only 11 feet long. Where did it go? So this little head, 175 grains, I've found is about enough. Shoot around a lighter woolly bugger, something like that. Any more weight than that, and it becomes hard to move the fly with the head, because the head's only got enough mass to move so much. It's just like a normal fly. Woo! You wouldn't try and cast, a giant weighted Clouser minnow on a 2-weight. Same goes with this, although you can get away with a little bit more with a head like this than you could a normal fly line. So, you got running line, you got a head. That's easy, that makes sense. And this is where I started getting confused when I started getting into this. See, normally you come from a fly fishing background, you say, oh, okay, I'm ready to fish. I throw a leader on there, let's Skagit cast. It's not that simple. What you need next is a tip. So you got a lot of options here. This is where things can get kind of confusing. Tips are tapered usually. It helps you turn the fly over. And they come in all different shapes and sizes. On this setup, I've been fishing an OPST Commando sink tip. This is a 40 grain riffle. I think that's their lightest sink tip. And this is just a 5-foot head, or 5-foot tip. So there's not much to it. You get into a lot bigger tips, but on a tiny little setup like this, a 5-foot head's about right. Loop to loop, just like anything. And thankfully, OPST labels their tips. So when you got a collection of, sinking, floating, fast sinking, slow sinking, you can see what's on there. And Rio does the same with these heads, which is really nice. So you don't just have a box full of heads. So now you've got a tip, and that's gonna sink your fly for you, because if you've ever swung a fly on a floating fly line, you know that swinging downstream or downstream and across, your fly doesn't really sink. And that's one of the reasons you need a tip if you're going to swing streamers. Now, after that, depending on what you're fishing for, your tippet material could be anything. This is a little setup that I fish on a 4-weight. So I'm usually fishing for, 10 to 18-inch trout, 18 if I'm lucky. So a little trout. And so I'll usually start out with 2 or 3X. And if I need to be less visible, maybe 4X, but probably not. You don't need a tapered leader. This head is going to turn that fly over with so much authority, you don't need the help of a leader being tapered. So just tie a loop in a piece of tippet, loop it through here, tie it to your fly. And the nice thing about having interchangeable tips that just have a loop-to-loop connection is you can change where you're fishing depth-wise, just like that. You don't have to add weight on the fly, you don't have to change flies. All you need to do is swap the tips out. Now this here is a Rio I-mount tip, and the cool thing about them is that they go from intermediate to sinking. So this has, I think it's 7.5 feet of intermediate line that just hovers below the surface. If you don't know what an intermediate line does, it sinks very slowly. And then on the front of it has actual sinking line. Let's see here. I'm sure Rio put an ID on here somewhere. There it is. Yeah, 7.5 foot intermediate, 2.5 foot T8. So that will give you a slower sink than a complete piece of T8. Oh. Skagit heads are really cool, whether you want to fish them on a single hander or a two-hander. This is actually a setup I use on a Swiss rod. The thing about them is they take a little bit of a learning curve, and sometimes you got to find the right head for your rod, you got to find the right tip for where you're fishing, and it's fiddly. It's definitely a little fiddly, but once you get it figured out, it's a whole different way to fish. And I encourage you to try it because it changes the places you can fish. Like one of my favorite trout streams is dense brush, back to back on the banks. No matter where you go, it's brush. So overhand, you can only really make a cast of 20 or 30 feet. It's not a very big stream. And this has changed the way I can fish there completely. You can even skip the sinking tips altogether, use a floating running line and a floating tip, and fish dry flies on it. It's a little different, more difficult, because you're going to end up stripping all these loop-to-loop connections back into the rod, which is, it's awkward. You don't need to do it, but it is awkward, because that's the head and the tip. Where the head and the tip meet, that's a 10-foot tip. And then you got, I think this head is 13 feet. So that's already 23 feet out of the tip of the rod. So then you got your running line, which is another awkward set of knots that have to go through your guides. It's definitely a different feel of fishing. And but something that definitely has a place and definitely can make fishing a lot easier in a lot of places. And something I'd encourage you to try. It is a bit of a steep learning curve. Casting is the hard part. Like figuring all this out, not as difficult as it seems. once you get casting figured out, you'll be all set. Thanks for watching, and check on other videos.